Hello, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Bryan Greene. Bryan is the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the National Association of Realtors. Welcome to my show, Bryan.
Thanks, Stephen. Nice to be here.
I wanted to speak with you, Bryan, because I wanted to learn more about the role of the association and the issue of accessible housing, which is, of course, my passion. So let's start at the very top. What is the National Association of Realtors? What is its role and mission in this world?
Sure. Well, we're one of the largest trade associations in the United States, if not the largest, with 1.6 million members. So when you hear the word realtor, what you're really hearing is not just any real estate agent, but a member of the National Association of Realtors. And as I said, we represent 1.6 million members. So folks who do sales, property managers, we have appraisers, we have other affiliated members who do commercial housing and mortgage lending. Yeah, really, we have a dominant place in the housing industry.
Are there many real estate agents who aren't members of the association?
There are a fraction who choose not to be.
Yeah, but the vast majority are, right?
Overwhelmingly, yes.
Yeah. And many of these folks are involved in residential side of things, helping, and even in the commercial side in multi-unit housing, many of your members are involved in that, correct?
That's right. The majority majority of our members are residential real estate agents. Most full-time, but you have plenty of
Yeah.
part-time folks too.
And I imagine some of them are involved in leasing and rental housing, not just in the ownership world that I'm more familiar with.
That's right. Absolutely. And we have a great number of people who do residential rentals.
So broadly speaking, what is the role of NAR? How does it help its members, and what's its role?
Well, at the core of what we do is advocacy. You introduced me as Vice President of Advocacy, Policy Advocacy. So I help develop policy that we advocate on. I'm here in Washington, D.C. That's where our advocacy shop is. And we advocate for laws and regulation, or sometimes against regulation, but always in the interests of the real estate profession. And that's pretty broad, right? It could be, it could concern tax policy, it can concern business issues. It also concerns fair housing and the rights of consumers. We are advocates for consumers who are buying and renting homes.
Well, this is exactly taking us right to the nut of it. I've been very concerned for several years about the, intense attention being paid about the affordability crisis and the lack of attention on what I call the accessibility crisis, and which some of my guests in previous episodes have called an invisible crisis of housing for people with disabilities in all shapes and forms and sizes. And so, what has NAR been doing to advocate for accessibility in housing?
Yeah, so it's a core of what we do, our advocacy for fair housing and accessible housing for people with disabilities. And it takes on a few forms. First, there's what we do here in Washington in terms of advocacy on the fair housing laws. And I want to speak a little bit about that in detail.
Right.
What we're
Before you
doing.
do that, I didn't mention it in introducing you, that
Mhm.
you have a long history working with HUD before you came to NAR, right?
That's right. That's
You
right.
worked in this area for nearly 30 years. Am I
Yes.
right? Good.
Yes,
Please. So
I've
please go
I've
ahead and
spent
share.
the better part of my life advocating on fair housing and the rights of people with disabilities, and so we do that here at the National Association of Realtors as well, in terms of what we advocate that the administration do and what we advocate that Congress do, and I'm happy to get into more detail on that. But I also want to point out that we, as an association, with respect to our membership, educate our membership not only on their fair housing obligations, but also how to advocate for consumers with disabilities, and what they can do and ought to do to make sure housing is accessible in the community. And then beyond that, there's state and local advocacy, making sure that we have state and local laws, not only that protect the rights of people with disabilities, but that promote accessible housing. So, accessible design in state building codes. There's a whole history there of, we don't have a national building code, and so states individually adopt various building codes, ideally those with accessible features, but there's never been a requirement that they do that. And so there's a lot that can be done at the community level to promote accessible design and accessible features in housing. So we educate our members and our state and local associations on the work that they can do in that respect. So it's a combination of advocacy for advocacy before governments, as well as education of our members so that they can exercise their rights, because they're trying to sell and lease homes. So they have an injury if there are barriers to people with disabilities. So I stress that it's their rights as agents that they are pursuing, but then also the rights of the consumers and the opportunities that exist for consumers to enjoy accessible housing.
So, one example that we talked about in our pre-interview was the Fair Haven program. Can you tell my listeners about Fair Haven?
Yeah, so Fair Haven is an innovative training program. We have decided we want to do more than just teach people fair housing in classrooms. And so we think when it comes to real estate agents, agents really like to apply um, the law to situations. And especially during this period of the pandemic when we're all on screens and computers are very accessible to us, we said, well, why don't we do training through a module? And we created sort of an interactive module that's scenario based, where a real estate agent is going through different scenarios where they have to close a deal, but they're confronted with potential fair housing issues, situations where they may misstep and violate the law, or where they witness others potentially violating the law. And then there are other situations where they're put in the seat of the consumer, where they're witnessing a transaction where there may be a violation of the law. So through this scenario-based training, we teach agents about all aspects of the fair housing law. And when it comes to the rights of people with disabilities, we cover the range of disability-related issues, from outright denial, discrimination and bias on the basis of someone's disability, but also reasonable accommodations so that someone can equally enjoy a dwelling, as well as what the rights are to seek reasonable, or to make reasonable modifications at the cost of the tenant or the consumer. And so we work through those issues. And then in addition to the scenarios, there are other resources that are built into the training platform so people can learn more. And we also have some videos in there too of real life
Oh,
situations that people have faced.
are those is Fairhaven this the simulation and videos, all of it? Is it available simply just to members, or could consumers and the public access it and run it as well?
Right now, it's just to members,
Oh,
to
okay.
our 1.6 million members. So that's another benefit of being a member of the National Association of Realtors. But we've given people tours of Fairhaven who are
Yeah,
not members, because we want people to know how we're training the industry and how we're leading the industry in this area. So we've given tours to media and some government officials so they can see it. And let me just say, there are other industry partners who have seen it, who want to emulate it. So we really do think it's a great way to teach.
that's fantastic. I don't know any realtors who have done this. And I should add that I'm a member of this organization as a licensed real estate agent. I'm a member of this organization too. I should have said that up front.
Mm,
So there's been a lot of talk in the last several years about diversity, inclusion, and equity. A lot of push black as a result of Black Lives Matter. And I know that NAR has been involved in training its members to be more sensitive to these issues as respect of subtle discrimination in housing.
mhm.
How has accessible housing been brought to bear by NAR in its inclusivity and diversity education that it's giving to its membership?
Yeah. Well, I think taken all together, as NAR has advanced fair housing, um, it's been an opportunity for us all to think about how we want to live, what kind of communities we want to have, and the need to make sure that as we build today, as we plan communities today, that they include everyone. So, I think during the pandemic and following the murder of George Floyd, um, a lot of people began to reflect on racial segregation in our communities and how we got here, and recognize that with suburbanization and um, the developments of subdivisions back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, we excluded people, and we had these grand designs for how Americans were going to live, but they excluded people of color, immigrants, etc. Now, as we have the opportunity uh, to build again, and we need to build because we have a very limited housing supply right now in the country, which is making housing unaffordable, is an opportunity to design with intention, where we recognize that okay, people of color have a place, that if we're going to design buildings, they need to be accessible to people with disabilities, and the way we live today, and the features that we need from cradle to late in life, and that those features benefit everybody. And so, and then accessible design of communities as well, so that everyone can enjoy community assets. So all of these issues now, and let me add energy efficiency too. And so all of these issues today offer us an opportunity to really design for the future, and be inclusive for the diversity that is still expanding really in this country. So we've embraced that at the National Association of Realtors. In my team, we work in a cross-disciplinary way to recognize that energy efficiency and fair housing, tax policy, all of it goes together, and we need to be thinking about the interests of everyone as we make decisions today.
So it's funny you mentioned tax policy because it's a good segue. On my show last week, I spoke to someone who's pushing HR 7676, which is new federal legislation to uh, that is being proposed that would give a tax break to people who do renovations for accessibilities in their homes by way of their 401k, a tax-free and tax penalty-free withdrawal from their 401ks, or a tax deduction if they're older for this purpose of up to $30,000. This is right now being discussed in Washington. First of all, are you aware of it? And second of all, what can NAR do to promote this idea? Because this would certainly be impactful. One of the things that's impactful about it is that if this becomes law, contractors all over the country and CPAs all over the country will begin to promote this idea, which is would allow people to stay in their homes for longer, live healthy and safe, and and not have to move when they can no longer physically use the space.
Mhm.
So can you comment on it? Are you in a position to
Well,
comment on it?
yeah. Well, I'll say that um, our um, our tax guy, Evan Lydiard, is probably aware of it. I'm personally not familiar with the bill. The way our committees work as well is when there is a bill, we evaluate whether or not we have existing policy on these issues, and because we are, membership based governance organization. So I should find out if this is something that our tax committee has looked at, and whether they have directed us to weigh in on the bill. Um, as you say, it does sound like it aligns very well with our advocacy on disability rights, and recognizes, how these interests can be advanced through tax policy. I would say more broadly, we have been looking at how a tax can incentivize um, an increase in housing supply. And as we've done that, we've said we need to include disability rights too. We've been doing quite a bit with the National Council of State Housing Agencies to explore how tax credit housing um, both can be expanded, and how we can ensure uh, that there's sufficient housing that's accessible for people with disabilities.
Um, I've been a real estate agent for 18 plus years, and the lack of education and basic understanding around disability is unsatisfactorily high in our industry. And in residential resales from one MLS to the other within the country, there's a complete lack of uniform standards around how to even identify features of a home that might be of value to a person with physical or cognitive challenges.
Yeah.
What can NAR do, and what is NAR doing to address this education gap? I know that there are designations for senior real estate specialists that the NAR promotes, but there's never been one for accessible housing or broader issues of housing for all from the NAR. What role could our organization, I'm a member too,
Yeah.
play in this regard?
No, that's a great point. And, I think we have begun to walk down that road. As you know, for quite some time now, there's been this designation, at home with diversity. I arrived at NAR 3 years ago, and, while that program, was was underway, I said, we need to do more to help people understand the more technical aspects of the fair housing laws. And so we have now a director of fair housing policy, and that's one of the areas that we've discussed exploring, whether we can do something that is more of a fair housing, a specific designation that goes through all of the provisions of the law. I mean, everyone's, required to comply with the Fair Housing Act. So to some extent, there's a presumption that people know the law. But I would agree that there are opportunities, especially in the area of accessible housing, where people can be more expert and better guides, and provide more affirmative assistance to people, because there's a difference between compliance and promoting more accessible design. I mean, like the Fair Housing Act, has, say, minimum accessibility requirements, but there are many who are incorporating more accessible design into um, very attractive home design. So I think there are opportunities for us to be leaders there.
Does the association, you mentioned before some of your collaborative partners that were interested in the simulation. Are you working with any of these collaborators around accessibility issues specifically?
That's a good question. Not that I'm aware of. Um, Items come up, of course, in the lending space and other areas where we engage, but I'm not aware of a specific accessible design conversation. Um, so, for example, I know the appraisers want to do more, and sort of emulate our our fair haven training program. I can't think of any accessible design issues that have come up in the appraisal space. I imagine there are ones that come up, but um,
Is there room for NAR to get behind some of these movements for universal design standards? I was speaking with a architect who's working with a nonprofit in the Bay Area that is developing standards for residential universal design in multifamily properties that would go far beyond the limited fair housing
right,
standard, or even California building code,
right,
which
and what
is
you
one of the, so is there a role for NAR to play in supporting efforts like that?
I think so. I mean, when I was at HUD, there were design competitions, for example, for single family homes, where the law doesn't have the same requirements. Um, and, I think we want to create these opportunities. So I think NAR can play a role there to encourage and promote more accessible design through innovative competitions and um, other sponsorship.
With your experience, I mean, I don't need to tell you, we definitely have seen a shift in the mentality around accessibility, broadly speaking, in 30 years, Crawley, from when you started it at HUD back then to where things are at now. But you wouldn't be in the role you're in if there still wasn't lots of work to do. What is the what are some of the issues that you're struggling with around housing accessibility in this environment?
Well, I think it's a combination. There's there are opportunities always to sort of bake accessibility into development, and I think that's where we gain the greatest advance. Where we can work with states to make sure that they're adopting, international building codes with the most up-to-date accessibility standards. I think that's something that ought to be done different places, and I think most, states now, after decades of litigation against uh, uh, developers, have recognized, it's better to just bake this in and not have developers have to, independently learn the requirements. And so, but there's still some work to be done there. So I think that's really important. And then, beyond that, um, I think there needs to be greater support for fair housing groups and others who are the monitors in communities to make sure that that buildings are accessible. Fair housing groups, continue to find, properties that after 1991 were supposed to be to meet minimum accessibility requirements for people with disabilities, and they don't. And so, they file lawsuits. Many times, our members are showing people condo units that they're having to retrofit, um, but should have actually been designed to be accessible in the first instance. So there, um, there's a role for both the private groups, which we support, and we've been advocating for more funding for those private groups to do that work. But there's also a role for government. Um, we at NAR support something called um, affirmatively furthering fair housing. So the Fair Housing Act not only prohibited discrimination, but it required that states and localities that get federal funding for community development take affirmative steps to create housing opportunity for all. And a big part of that is ensuring that there's sufficient housing, sufficient accessible housing for people with disabilities. Um, and HUD oversees that, and when it advises communities on how they should be looking at their obligations, they have a significant discussion of, well, what are the disability related housing needs in your community, and are you meeting that? So we've said that provision of the law and the regulations that HUD has promulgated there need to be stronger, so that we can make sure that communities that are getting our taxpayer dollars are serving all residents. So that's really key. We also, strong supporters of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and your listeners, I'm sure, know that while the Fair Housing Act principally concerns housing, the Americans with Disabilities Act concerns public places, as well as commercial um, establishments, and we think that's going to be very important, continue to be very important going forward. We uh, stress this with our brokerages, that their websites need to be accessible
Yeah,
to people.
that's a huge issue right now, website accessibility.
Exactly.
There's a lot of lawsuits going on about that.
Right. There's a lot of litigation. I mean,
Mhm.
and the key here is, people with disabilities need to be able to search for housing just like anybody else.
Of
And,
course.
you don't want people shut out at that very early stage. And then, of course, we recognize there's the physical barriers, after people inquire about the housing. But certainly, websites shouldn't be turning people away. So we've been providing guidance to uh, our brokerages on that. DOJ just put out some guidance this year, which we've shared with all of our members on how they can make sure their websites are accessible. Um, but all of these things, from website access to making sure government is enforcing existing laws, that government is adopting universal design. Um, and that private fair housing groups are well supported in communities. We at the National Association of Realtors have been supporting.
Can you comment a bit about the changing technology? I've done a lot of interviews recently with clients, with interviews guests who have been talking about how technology is transforming the way people are able to live and be supported in their living in their homes when they're needing support. And I'm talking about things far beyond, the smart speakers that will turn on your lights. Um, First of all, are you aware of this trend? And second of all, how can NAR play a role in that?
Yeah, I'm modestly aware. Yeah, we have an area now. I have a technology policy rep, and one of the key areas I've told her we need to focus more on is accessibility and fair housing generally. And so we have a conference that we do every year called IOI, where we're trying to place a greater focus on these issues. So that's actually something that we're contemplating, having a panel where some of these technologies can be highlighted.
That's cool. That's cool. Is there anything else going on at NAR right now in this space, in this area, that my listeners might be interested in knowing about how NAR works to promote accessibility?
Well, yeah, I mean, just in general, we are concerned about the entire community, right?
Right.
Uh, because it's not just the house or the apartment building, but it's the entire community. So we have been advocating for accessibility and livability in communities broadly. So we're taking on a bold vision there. So when we talk about ADA, we're talking about making sure that communities comply, that there are curb cuts and the other uh, important features in the overall community, so that people, so this is seamless, so that people with disabilities can enjoy the whole community. We've actually provided some placemaking grants as well, that allow local associations who want to take on some of these efforts to do that. So while some associations may seek a placemaking grant to like clean up a park, or remove community eyesores. Um, there are others who've said, let's make a local trail ADA compliant. And so we've been highlighting and publicizing some of those examples of ways that realtor associations can be on the leading edge. So, so just in general, we're encouraging our members to think in terms of the entire community as we at NAR advocate for more housing and housing supply. We are looking at our communities comprehensively to make sure that they include all and are accessible to all.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, Bryan, because last year I did an interview with people from the Idaho Access Project, and they are trying to get developers to buy into this idea that their community should be accessible, not just one home in a tract development, one model of a tract development of four models, right?
Yeah.
And that we should have visitability. I'm not sure if you're aware of the concept of
Oh,
visitability, but it's the
absolutely.
idea. Yeah, it's the idea where, for my listeners who might not know, it's the idea that you can go into any house and have a bathroom, bedroom, and
Yeah.
access for a wheelchair user on the main level, even if you don't live there, so that people who
And
have
even
an
if the law
accessible
doesn't
home,
require it. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so even if you have a disability and your home has been modified, you're not shut out of going to visit your neighbor or your friend down the street. And I think that's all part of designing communities
Absolutely.
as well.
This should, right.
There's yeah, there's so much more I wish we could talk about, Bryan, but I am out of time, and I just wanted to first of all thank you so much for coming on my show today. If people want to learn more about the work of NAR, National Association of Realtors in this area, is there where how would they get that information?
Well, they can come to our website. So
Yeah.
very simply, nar.realtor. And then we have a very prominent area on fair housing, and that guides to a lot of this work.
Awesome. 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 All right. Well, I appreciate very much your time. Thank you for being on my show.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to be here.